Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for watching or listening to the podcast. 1 million ground troops. That is the historic hell Iran is promising if the U.S. moves on the southern front. We aren't just talking about a standoff anymore. We're talking about a mobilization the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. With the Strait of Hormuz on a knife edge and volunteers flooding the IRGC, the question is the U.S. walking into the biggest trap in modern military history? We have the latest updates you won't see on mainstream media. If you want the truth as it breaks, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to see the scale of this move, and subscribe so you never miss a beat. But first, I want to hear from you. Is this a genius deterrent or a recipe for a disaster? Get in the comments right now. Don't hold back. Give me your boldest take. Is the world ready for what's coming? Let's start the debate below because things are about to get real.
Yeah, that number, 1 million troops, it's just massive. And to really grasp the scale of the last updates, we have to look at the raw geostrategic implications of this kind of mobilization on that southern front,
right,
along with those explicit threats regarding the Strait of Hormuz based on the last info available. Relocating 1 million troops, I mean, it isn't just ordering men to march south.
Right, you're moving a city.
Literally. You're shifting an entire mid-sized city's worth of combatants, heavy armor, medical units, complex supply chains directly to a contested coastline. It establishes this deeply entrenched defensive line, and that alters the fundamental calculus of any invading force. It's a foundational shift in regional security.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer number is staggering, and I want to look at the mechanics here.
Let's do it.
Because it's almost like a fortress where the defenders aren't just bracing for a siege, they are actively welcoming it. The phrase explicitly used in the recent updates to describe what awaits any potential U.S. operation on this southern front is a historic hell on their own soil.
Yeah, historic hell. It's very deliberate phrasing.
But, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Is a massive number of ground troops still an effective deterrent in modern technology-driven warfare? Or is this primarily a psychological tactic? I mean, we live in an era of unmanned drones, stealth bombers, precision-guided munitions.
Right, satellite surveillance that can read a license plate.
Exactly. 1 million ground troops sounds terrifying on paper, but against a technologically superior adversary with total air dominance isn't a massive concentration of infantry just, well, the world's largest target practice.
That is the core dilemma of modern asymmetric warfare. And to understand it, we have to look at the geography of that southern front.
Okay.
Because they aren't just lining up 1 million men shoulder to shoulder in the flat desert waiting for an airstrike.
Right, they're not just standing out in the open.
Exactly. They are integrating this massive force into a highly complex, heavily fortified environment. We were talking about the Zagros Mountains, deep underground bunker complexes, rugged coastal terrain.
Wow.
The strategy here relies on a concept called anti-access area denial, or A2AD.
A2AD.
Right. The goal isn't to win a sterile high-tech shootout in the sky. The goal is to survive the initial wave of precision strikes by using deep tunneling and decentralized dispersal.
So you dig in, decentralize, and basically absorb the technological blow.
Exactly. You force the invading military to eventually put boots on the ground to secure the territory. You can bomb radar stations and disrupt supply depots from 30,000 feet all day long. But to actually control the southern front and, neutralize the threat to maritime traffic, an adversary eventually has to send in ground forces.
Because you cannot occupy and hold a contested coastline solely from the air.
Precisely. And that is where the million-man mobilization comes into play. Once an invading force is actually on the ground, the conflict changes completely. Grueling face-to-face war of attrition. And the last info specifically notes the quote-unquote enthusiasm of this defending force.
Right, which is a huge factor.
Huge when you combine heavily fortified, familiar terrain with a massive, highly motivated defending army. The friction of war increases exponentially. Technology gives an invading force an edge, sure, but it cannot easily erase the physical and logistical nightmare of clearing out 1 million entrenched defenders mile by mile.
So what does this all mean? I mean, it sounds less like fighting a traditional army and more like trying to dismantle a hornet's nest with a sniper rifle.
That's a great way to put it.
The high-tech weapon is incredibly precise, but it's fundamentally the wrong tool for dealing with an overwhelming decentralized swarm that is deeply embedded in the environment.
That analogy captures the tactical reality perfectly. And this brings us to the broader strategic concept of deterrence.
Right.
Deterrence is not merely about convincing an adversary that you can outright defeat them on a battlefield. It is about proving that the cost of engagement—
Like casualties, lost equipment, time.
Exactly. Proving that the cost will be so unbearably high that the invasion just isn't worth initiating in the first place. Announcing a localized force of 1 million personnel eager to unleash a historic hell is a deliberate mechanism to maximize that perceived cost.
But, manpower alone doesn't automatically equal combat effectiveness, which leads us to a massive demographic shift highlighted in the recent news.
Right, the volunteers.
Yeah, it's not just the regular standing army being ordered to the front. We are seeing a flood of youth volunteers. The last info details a massive influx of formal petitions from young people explicitly requesting frontline deployments.
And they aren't just joining the regular army, right?
Exactly. They are funneling into specific branches.
Yeah.
The Basij and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC.
Which is a crucial distinction. To understand the geostrategic impact of that shift, we have to clearly define what those branches actually do.
Right, because they aren't standard military.
No, they operate very differently. The regular army is traditionally tasked with defending the national borders against external threats. But the IRGC is a parallel military structure, heavily focused on asymmetric warfare, internal security, and ideological defense. And within that ecosystem, you have the Basij.
And the Basij are the paramilitaries.
Yes. They aren't your standard infantry. They are a paramilitary volunteer militia. Think of them as a highly ideological, neighborhood-level defense force.
Wow.
They can mobilize civilians into combat units at a moment's notice.
It's almost like a military operating with a heavily crowdsourced defense system. Yeah. But I have to ask, how does this actually function against a highly disciplined adversary?
What do you mean?
I mean, I hear you on the ideological fervor, but from a purely tactical standpoint, doesn't flooding elite military units with enthusiastic teenagers just create chaos on the battlefield?
Oh, absolutely.
Because traditional military doctrine relies on rigorous training, predictable maneuvers, and unbreakable chain of command. If you integrate thousands of untrained but highly enthusiastic volunteers, how does that impact traditional command and control on the Southern Front?
Well, it does create chaos, but it is a weaponized, intentional chaos.
Intentional chaos.
Yeah. If we look back at the historical context of the region, specifically the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, we saw the deployment of massive human wave attacks using lightly trained volunteers.
Right, I remember reading about that.
What we are seeing in the latest updates is essentially the 21st century evolution of that doctrine. They're taking that same societal mobilization and ideological fervor, but, updating it for the drone era.
Oh, wow.
These volunteers don't need to execute complex combined arms maneuvers like a NATO battalion would.
Because they're in that A280 network.
Exactly. In a decentralized A280 network, their job might be as simple as operating a loitering munition.
Or setting up a mobile anti-tank missile in a mountain pass.
Exactly. Or manning a fast attack swarm boat on the coast.
So you were saying the lack of traditional predictability is actually the feature, not the bug.
That is the exact mechanism that neutralizes advanced military planning. Traditional militaries spend decades training to fight other traditional militaries.
Right. They expect logic.
They expect their opponents to preserve forces, to retreat when they are mathematically outgunned. A surge of youth volunteers introduces this massive wildcard element.
Because they're driven by societal and ideological fervor.
Exactly. Rather than just professional military duty, which makes them far less risk-averse. For an invading commander, trying to predict the movements of a deeply entrenched, deeply motivated volunteer force that is structurally supported by the IRGC, it's a logistical nightmare.
It fundamentally changes the target profile. A machine has logic, You can analyze its supply lines and break its parts.
Right.
But a movement is organic, it replaces its losses quickly, it adapts irregularly, and it is incredibly difficult to dismantle from the top down. And these forces, this million-man army blended with a crowdsourced volunteer swarm, they aren't just standing in the desert.
No, not at all.
The last updates tie this entire mobilization directly to a critical geographical choke point.
Yeah, the geostrategic puzzle pieces lock together when you look at where this southern front actually is. This massive ground mobilization is anchoring the coastline adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz.
The ultimate choke point.
What's fascinating here is that we are looking at a dual-threat environment that is practically unprecedented.
Unprecedented how?
Well, an adversary is facing a scenario where they must deal with a closed global maritime artery on one hand, while staring down a fortified million-strong asymmetric ground force on the immediate coastline.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the rhetoric regarding the strait in these latest updates is incredibly specific.
And defiant.
Very defiant. The news explicitly mentions an assertion that the U.S. wants to open the Strait of Hormuz using what they call suicide and self-destructive tactics.
Right.
And the response from the defending side is essentially, we are fully prepared for you to execute that suicide strategy, and we are still going to keep the strait closed.
Yeah.
But I need to pause on that phrasing. Why use the word suicide? I mean, the U.S. Navy is arguably the most powerful maritime force in human history.
It is.
So why would attempting to open a vital international waterway be classified as a self-destructive tactic?
It comes entirely down to the unforgiving geography of the Strait of Hormuz itself. The strait is not the open ocean.
Right.
At its narrowest point, it is only 21 miles wide. And the actual shipping lanes deep enough for massive vessels to safely navigate. They are only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly narrow.
It is. For a traditional naval force, like, say, a U.S. carrier strike group, which relies on hundreds of miles of open water for defense and maneuverability.
Right. They need space.
Entering that confined space is incredibly dangerous.
Because all of that advanced naval technology is suddenly trapped in a geographic bottleneck.
Exactly. So when the updates refer to self-destructive tactics, it is an assessment based on the mechanics of coastal defense. If the strait is deadbolted, how is it deadbolted?
How so?
It is closed using advanced naval mines, swarms of fast-attack explosive boats operated by the IRGC, and hundreds of anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles.
And those are hidden inside commercial trucks or buried in those coastal mountains we discussed earlier?
Exactly. So if a conventional multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier enters that 21-mile-wide choke point to forcibly clear it, they are operating directly inside the optimal kill zone of that decentralized million-man defense network.
It's like the front door of the global economy has been deadbolted from the inside.
Yeah.
But instead of just a lock, the porch is rigged with explosives, the surrounding hills are heavily armed, and there's a million guards standing there daring you to kick the door in.
That's exactly what it is.
But the U.S. or any global coalition has to act because the global economy requires the oil and liquefied natural gas that flows through that strait. But by acting, they are forced to play on the defenders' terms. So let me ask you this. If the last info suggests Iran is actually inviting these so-called self-destructive tactics, does that mean they view the closure of the strait not as a temporary tactic, but as their ultimate strategic trump card?
You've identified the ultimate geostrategic trap outlined in this mobilization. By closing the waterway, you force the technologically superior opponent to react.
Because the international market demands it.
Yes. But by reacting and entering that confined maritime space, the opponent forfeits their primary advantages of distance, stealth, and maneuverability.
They play right into the teeth of the A2AD network.
Precisely. The assertion that any intervention would be suicide is a declaration that they believe they have successfully leveraged regional geography and overwhelming manpower to completely neutralize technological superiority.
So if we look at the last info as a cohesive strategy rather than isolated incidents, it's not just about guarding a border.
No.
It is about creating a localized dominance so absolute that even a global superpower has to second-guess its involvement.
It is a textbook demonstration of ultimate regional denial. They are intentionally shifting the burden of escalation entirely onto the adversary.
Wow.
By absorbing the massive youth volunteer surge into the Basij and the IRGC, they are signaling a readiness for a protracted, grueling, asymmetric conflict on land.
And simultaneously daring a naval conflict in a geographic bottleneck.
Right, where they believe the tactical math is heavily in their favor. Keeping the strait closed isn't merely a temporary economic blockade. According to the posture in these updates, it is their ultimate strategic trump card.
Which brings this entire deep dive into sharp focus. If we pull all these threads together, we are looking at 3 incredibly robust pillars defining this standoff based on the last updates. First, the raw logistics. An unprecedented 1 million-man mobilization heavily entrenched along the southern front, utilizing deep geography and A2AD tactics to promise a historic hell for any occupying force.
Right.
Second, the demographic shift. A massive surge of youth volunteers formally petitioning for deployment, transforming traditional military doctrine into a heavily crowdsourced, ideologically driven swarm managed by the IRGC and Basij.
Yeah.
And third, the geographic trap. The resolute stance to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, leveraging a narrow maritime choke point to dare adversaries into naval maneuvers that the defenders openly classify as self-destructive.
And for you listening to this deep dive, it is critical to look beyond the surface-level rhetoric and recognize why these mechanics matter to you.
Exactly.
This isn't abstract geopolitical theory or, distant posturing. We are breaking down a massive geostrategic shift playing out in real time.
It's happening right now.
The combination of a closed global maritime artery, which handles a massive percentage of the world's energy supply, and an energized, deeply entrenched, million-strong localized force doesn't just threaten regional stability.
No, it goes way beyond that.
It has the potential to dictate the future of international trade, supply chain viability, and the very doctrine of how modern military engagements are fought.
It forces a total reevaluation of how asymmetric conflicts are managed. When advanced diagnostic planning meets the muddy, complex reality of a decentralized mass mobilization, the old rulebook is thrown at the window.
It absolutely is. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over based on the strategic mechanics we've analyzed today.
Let's hear it.
If modern warfare relies on precision and technology, but a nation builds its ultimate defense on the sheer enthusiasm of over 1 million citizens welcoming a historic hell, do we need to completely rewrite the rules of global deterrence?
That is the perfect question to end on. Because when the technology meets an immovable geographic and human reality, everything we think we know about military dominance gets tested. Thank you, everyone, so much for watching and listening to this deep dive. If this analysis helped you connect the dots on today's geostrategic landscape, please check out and listen to our other podcasts. We will catch you on the next one.